Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly shocking sequence of events, the Danville arson attack. But more importantly, we're taking a magnifying glass to the incredibly complex legal strategy that was constructed in its aftermath. You might be wondering, why does this matter to us? Well, because it tests the absolute boundaries of our legal system. How do you defend the seemingly indefensible? Let's stick strictly to the facts and look at the actual legal mechanisms at play here.
Okay, let's dive into this. We are cold opening right inside the interrogation room with Sergeant Clay and Corporal Grace of the Danville Police Department. They sit down, they read Shotzi Buck Hayes his Miranda rights, and instead of denying involvement or asking for a lawyer, Shotzi immediately and frankly confesses. He just says it. I threw a bucket of gasoline on him because he had sex with my wife.
Now, because of that immediate confession and the fact that the entire horrific attack was actually caught on video, the narrative instantly shifts. Right? This is not your traditional whodunit. There's absolutely zero mystery about who committed the crime or who the victim was. Instead, for the defense attorneys tasked with representing Hayes, this becomes a fascinating, high-stakes legal puzzle. How do you defend someone who is literally on tape admitting to such a premeditated and violent act?
Part 1. The Love Triangle Timeline. Let's trace the background of this affair.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the massive gap in time. But first, to understand the defense's approach, we really have to know the players involved. The victim in this case, Lee Vogler, was a super prominent figure in the community. Actually, he was the youngest person ever elected to the Danville City Council at just 24 years old. He was known for community building, supporting local businesses, the whole 9 yards. But according to Shotzi Hayes, Vogler had become intertwined in a deeply personal conflict. The timeline here is crucial. Shotzi believed an affair between his wife, Mary Alice, and Councilman Vogler started around September 2024. About 10 months later, Mary Alice asked for a divorce. And then, the attack happens on July 30th, 2025. Look at that huge gap between the discovery of the alleged infidelity and the violent act itself. Keep this timeline locked in your head because, as we'll see shortly, this specific delay becomes the absolute central issue in the legal defense.
Part 2. The day of the attack, July 30, 2025.
Hayes admitted to detectives that his actions were sparked by a highly triggering phone conversation he had with his wife earlier that very day. They argued about his past mistakes, borderline addiction issues, and his severe PTSD. Feeling totally rejected and believing his future family was destroyed, Hayes took a bucket from his basement, he actually emptied out a pile of rice that was in it, and drove to a gas station. He bought just $3 worth of gasoline. But the next detail is probably the most chilling when it comes to premeditation. He added styrofoam to the gasoline. Why? Well, he admitted to police he thought it would make the fire burn longer, acting almost like a makeshift napalm. He then drove to Vogler's workplace, the Showcase magazine offices, waited for Vogler to open the door, threw the gasoline on him, and literally chased him out onto the street before setting him ablaze.
60%. To put that into perspective, that number represents an absolute miracle of survival. First responders rushed to an incredibly chaotic and horrifying scene, where witnesses were screaming in terror. Vogler was found still smelling heavily of gas, having sustained severe second- and third-degree burns over 60% of his entire body.
The medical fallout was frankly catastrophic. Vogler suffered from intense burn shock, septic shock, and his lungs were severely damaged due to smoke inhalation. He spent months recovering at the UNCC Burn Center at Duke. It was a massive uphill battle. Yet, astonishingly, Vogler survived. And not only did he survive, but he eventually returned to his normal duties as a city councilman. Truly incredible resilience.
So with the victim surviving, Hayes was now facing charges of attempted murder and aggravated malicious wounding. This brings us to defense attorney Matt Peak, who took over the case from his associate Ed Lovato. Peak looked at the mountains of evidence and realized, look, the defense couldn't simply deny the event happened. It was on video. Instead, he argued that the underlying love triangle provided evidence that could be considered legally mitigating. In his view, it wasn't just a simple case of someone randomly acting deranged. There was a complex psychological context.
Part 3. Defending the indefensible. Let's unpack legal mitigation.
So how exactly do you utilize mitigation when your client's actions are caught on camera and immediately confessed to? Well, it all comes down to the heat of passion defense. This is classic textbook law school material, right? The famous example is a spouse coming home, unexpectedly finding their partner in bed with someone else, losing their mind in that exact split second, and committing an act of violence. The law actually recognizes that humans can be driven to act on pure, uncontrollable impulse when faced with extreme, immediate provocation.
And this brilliantly illustrates the strategy.
Attorney Matt Peake explains the absolutely crucial difference between a legal justification and a legal excuse. Think of it like this. Self-defense is a justification. It means the law says your violent act was legally the right thing to do to protect yourself. Heat of passion, on the other hand, is a legal excuse. It doesn't mean setting someone on fire is okay. The law is never, ever going to say that's acceptable. But it aims to mitigate or lessen the punishment for that wrongful act by providing context for the perpetrator's extreme, temporary state of mind.
But here is the fatal flaw in the defense's strategy and exactly why that timeline we discussed earlier is so incredibly important. For a heat of passion defense to work in court, the reaction literally must be immediate. If there is a cooling off period between the provocation and the crime, the whole defense just crumbles. Hayes testified he caught Vogler and his wife in a loving embrace at a restaurant, which sent him into a paranoid tailspin. But remember, months passed. He had plenty of time to have a phone call, go to a gas station, intentionally mix gasoline with styrofoam, and wait at an office. The law views this massive delay as a definitive cooling off period, which heavily damaged the heat of passion argument.
Knowing the heat of passion defense was critically weakened by that cooling off period, the defense team rigorously explored mental health avenues. They filed a bunch of motions in Virginia for a competency evaluation, a not guilty by reason of insanity evaluation, and a diminished capacity evaluation. That last one is actually a relatively new concept in Virginia that argues a person couldn't fully grasp the gravity of their actions due to cognitive or mental health issues. However, despite throwing all these motions at the wall, none of the evaluations came back with evidence viable enough to actually put an expert on the stand at a trial, which led to a massive critical strategic pivot. Just a couple of weeks before the trial was set to kick off, the court had already subpoenaed over 200 jurors for what was shaping up to be one of Danville's biggest cases in years. The defense had to sit down and carefully weigh the enormous risks of putting Hayes in front of a jury of his peers. So the crucial point is this staggering number 42. If Hayes went to trial, requested jury sentencing, and the jury convicted him on all charges, which included aggravated malicious wounding, attempted murder, and breaking and entering with a deadly weapon, the mandatory minimum sentence they could give him was 42 years. A jury legally could not go a single day below that. Facing that absolutely staggering floor, Hayes and his team made the tough call to avoid the jury altogether, accept responsibility, and take a plea deal directly to Judge Reynolds.
Part 4, the final verdict. Let's look at the sentencing.
Ultimately, Hayes pled guilty to the two most severe charges: aggravated malicious wounding, which, fun fact, in Virginia actually carries a higher maximum penalty than attempted murder, and attempted first-degree murder. The judge handed down a very severe penalty. He got a life sentence, with all but 40 years suspended. Under Virginia law, Hayes has to serve at least 85% of that active 40-year sentence. Plus, he's under a permanent zero-contact order regarding Lee Vogler. So, practically speaking, Hayes will likely be sitting in prison until his late 40s or early 50s.
So the legal battle is officially over. Lee Vogler is miraculously back at work, serving his community as if he didn't skip a beat. Shotzi Hayes is serving his decades in a state prison. But as defense attorney Matt Peake astutely noted, there is one central figure in this entire saga who has never, ever publicly testified or spoken: the now ex-wife, Mary Alice.
Which leaves us with this final, lingering thought. We've examined the hard facts, the timelines, and the incredibly complex legal maneuverings of mitigation and the heat of passion. But if a wider lens, say a true crime documentary, is ever placed on this case, what missing puzzle pieces might that silent spouse finally provide? It's a striking reminder that in the courtroom, we deal strictly with the law and the evidence, but the human story behind it all is often far more intricate and hidden. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those tough questions, and I'll see you next time.